How would you feel if I started my lecture by asking you to bow your head and pray with me? Would you be offended? Would it make you mad? If it did, you could simply stop the lecture. But what if you were a high school student and I was your classroom teacher or your football coach? Would you feel free to walk away? Should you have to? These are the kinds of questions that the U.S. Supreme Court faced in the year 2000 in a case called Santa Fe Independent School District versus Doe. In order to understand how the court dealt with the issue, we need a little background. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution addresses the relationship between government and religion. It says simply that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. These simple words, however, are anything but simple. Many people mistakenly believe that the Constitution requires a wall of separation between church and state. In fact, this metaphor, though popular, isn't very accurate. Government services can and are provided to religious institutions. The classic example is that firemen can put out a fire in a church. We don't forbid religious leaders from running for office. Politicians, even the president, can ask Americans to pray. Congress has a chaplain and opens every session with a prayer. You have a dollar bill on you? Take a look at it sometime. It says, "In God we trust." Obviously, government and religion will be intertwined to some extent, but when is the line crossed? Prayer in schools is one of the issues that makes up this debate, and the debate has been divisive and politically charged. In 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court declared school-sponsored prayer unconstitutional, even when the prayer was non-denominational. In a series of subsequent decisions extending to the present day, the Supreme Court has declared mandatory recitation of Bible verses illegal, struck down a statute authorizing a mandatory moment of silence in public schools, and prohibited clergy-led prayers at public school graduations. Supporters of these decisions see dangers in allowing prayer in school. They say it may force students to engage in speech against their will by forcing them to pray. They say there's a fear of religious indoctrination, particularly for young students. But advocates of school prayer disagree. They argue that the court's insistence on strict government neutrality with respect to religion actually conceals government hostility to religion. They argue that the prohibition on religion in schools really amounts to a government endorsement of secular humanism. Further, they suggest that it's important to introduce values and ethics in schools, and some even blame societal problems on the absence of prayer in schools. Is school prayer an establishment of religion in violation of the First Amendment? Or is the prohibition on school prayer a violation of the free exercise of religion in violation of the First Amendment? These questions were revisited by the Supreme Court in the Santa Fe case. The case arose when the Santa Fe, Texas School District initiated a policy to allow invocation or prayers at football games and over the school's public address system. The policy was based on the school district's interest in making the events solemn, in promoting good sportsmanship, and in establishing an appropriate environment. The invocations were to be written by students, given by students, and had to be non-sectarian and non-proselytizing. Student speakers were to be selected by a vote of the entire student body, and indeed a prior vote showed that a majority of students wanted formal prayers before football games. Now, the school district defended its policy on the ground that the prayers were not coercive, because students were not required to attend the games or participate in the prayers. It also argued that the school had no control over the content of the students' message. But in 1999, a Mormon and a Catholic family filed suit, charging that Santa Fe's policy violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court held that the Santa Fe policy was unconstitutional. As author of the majority opinion, Justice Stevens wrote that school sponsorship of a religious message is impermissible. And this is what he said. He wrote, "It sends the ancillary message to members of the audience who are non-adherents that they are outsiders, not full members of the political community." The Supreme Court held that allowing school-associated prayer at football games was a state-sponsored religious activity and thus unconstitutional. It said that such prayers unconstitutionally coerce those attending into participating, and held that the government can't endorse a religious message even if a majority of the students want it. However, the Supreme Court said that spontaneous student-initiated prayer is protected free speech. For example, a prayer offered by the captain of a football team in a huddle would be protected speech, but a prayer led by the football coach would be impermissible. Now, the dissent claimed that the majority's decision was an expression of hostility to religion and a misreading of the First Amendment. In the language of Chief Justice Rehnquist's dissent, the court's opinion bristles with hostility to all things religious in public life. Many people assume that once the Supreme Court makes a decision, the story ends. They assume the losing party complies with the decision and life goes on. This is often not the case. There is widespread dissatisfaction and resistance to the court's Santa Fe ruling. Many school districts, particularly in the South, have openly defied the ruling, holding prayers at school events. Here's one example. In the town of Yellville, Arkansas, the local school board organized cheerleaders to line up at the 50-yard line and trade in their pom-poms for banners proclaiming biblical passages. They also knelt and prayed. On the other hand, supporters of the decision point out that there remain lots of opportunities for religious students to express their beliefs. For example, the Supreme Court has held that students can organize prayer groups on school property. Students do not leave all of their rights at the schoolhouse door. Prayer in public school raises tough questions about the tension between a student's constitutional right to freely exercise her religious belief and the constitutional prohibition against schools establishing religion. Has the Supreme Court struck the appropriate balance? President Ronald Reagan, a supporter of prayer in schools, was not overly concerned. As he wryly observed, "As long as there are tests in school, there will be prayer in school."